LinkedIn News.
And there are some people who are consistent supercommunicators. There are some people who can connect with literally anyone. And it's not because they're really outgoing or really charismatic or that they're extroverts. It's that they have recognized that what you do in those calls with your friends or with your dad or with your partner is a set of skills. And once we identify those skills, we can use them with anyone. Supercommunicators are just people who understand what skills make communication work and then use those skills when they want to connect with someone.
That's Charles Duhigg, author and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Stay tuned for more on how to become a super communicator. Make sure you hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you're a regular listener, consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more of the kinds of conversations you love. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. Have you ever left a meeting feeling like you were heard but perhaps not fully understood? Or do you have a recurring conflict with colleagues or even at home that you just can't seem to move past? Today, I invited Charles Duhigg onto the show. He's the author of the well-known book, The Power of Habit, and more recently, Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. We sat down to talk about why communication fails so often and how we can better connect with other people by improving this skill. Yes, it is a skill that you can improve upon. And Charles is bringing in stories and research that were both surprising and refreshing to me. Charles says that knowing, for example, which types of conversations we're having, and there are 3, or the core rules for a meaningful conversation, of which there are 4, can elevate the way we communicate with each other and ultimately how we connect with one another. Here's Charles.
I was a reporter at the New York Times, and then they made me a manager. And I thought that I would be a great manager, right? I was like, I have an MBA from Harvard. I've had managers my whole life. I'm going to kill this. And I was totally fine at like logistics and strategy and terrible at communication. I was terrible in that way where you don't know you're terrible at it, right? Like where it catches you completely off guard. People would come in with problems and I wouldn't show them that I was listening to them. They would come to me with emotional issues and I'd try and just solve their feelings. And I got into this pattern at home with my wife where I would come home from work after a long day and I'd start complaining about my day. And she would offer me this really good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch? And, you guys can get to know each other. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice, which is probably something that you and anyone listening, you probably have this element of this in your own relationship.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And so I was just confused. I'm a professional communicator. I was confused why I was not better at this. And so I went to some experts and I said, tell me what I'm doing wrong. Like, what am I missing here? And they said, well, we're actually glad you came because it's a good time to come. We're living through this golden age of understanding communication. And they said, here's what we've figured out. We have figured out, particularly from neuroscience, that we tend to think of a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about your day or where to go on vacation or the kids' grades. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And those conversations, they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There's practical conversations where we're talking about making plans or, solving problems. But then there's also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the social identities that are important to us. And they said, what we've learned is if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, it's really hard to hear each other. It's really hard to connect. And so this is actually known in psychology as the matching principle. And what it says is The key to successful communication is first and foremost having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And when we do that, when we learn to identify what kind of conversation is happening and match each other and then invite someone to match ourselves, that's when we really communicate, which is, of course, what was screwing up my conversations with my wife. I was having an emotional conversation. She was having a practical conversation. And it wasn't until we could get aligned that we could really hear each other and connect.
So when you're in a conversation with someone, and I do relate to this at home, at work, and you're like, they just aren't listening to me. I just don't feel seen or heard. Is what we're talking about the fact that we are having two different kinds of conversations typically?
So yes, very often that's exactly what's happening. Let me ask you, are you married or do you have a partner?
I have a partner, yeah.
Okay, so I'm assuming that there are times that you don't feel listened to by your partner and your partner doesn't feel listened to by you. Is that a safe assumption?
I will neither confirm nor deny. No, of course. Yeah, of course. Yes. There are times where I'm like, he's just not listening. Or, the problem solving piece I heard you mention, it's like, I'm trying to share something that's going on for me, but I don't actually need my problem solved. I just need to feel heard.
That's exactly right. And my guess is your partner is not actually saying like, I'm just going to ignore her. Like I'm going to play fantasy football in my head.
Right.
He's trying to listen and you're trying to listen to him. But if you're having this different kind of conversation, you never actually feel aligned. Within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment. When we're communicating with someone successfully, our brain activity starts to look alike. And if you're having an emotional conversation and you're using the amygdala, the deep interior structures of your brain, and your partner is having a practical conversation, he's using the prefrontal cortex, then you can't actually become entrained because you're using different parts of your brain. You have to match each other. And once you do, once he says, look, I want to empathize, I'm not going to try and solve your feelings, like let's talk about how you feel, he might very well at some point say, hey, now that we've talked a little bit about how you feel and I understand, can we talk about some solutions? And you guys will move into a practical conversation together. It's not that one conversation is right or wrong or better or worse. It's that we're having the same kind of conversation at the same time. And once we're aligned, once we're entrained, we can move from conversation to conversation in tandem.
And so is the idea that a super communicator knows exactly what's happening when and is able to track and move through a conversation? Like, what are the components of being a super communicator then? So
what a super communicator does is they just pay attention to this question, right? It doesn't mean that you're perfect at it. It means that you're aware of it. And I can kind of demonstrate what a super communicator is. Let's say I ask you a question. Let's say you're a physician and I say, oh, why'd you decide to go to medical school? Mm-hmm. The same person might answer that question in two very different ways. Depending on the state of mind they're in, depending on their mood, they might say, oh, I wanted a steady job, and I knew that there would always be demand for doctors. Okay, this is a person who is in a kind of practical mindset, right? Mm-hmm. But that same person might also answer the same question by saying, oh, actually, my dad got sick when I was a kid, and I saw these doctors take care of him, and I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be the person who could help other people. So that's much more of a social mindset, maybe even an emotional mindset. And the matching principle says, listen for those clues. And if this person is in a practical mindset, lean into the practical. If they're in an emotional mindset, lean into the emotional. Same thing with social. In schools, they teach teachers to do this by saying, ask a student when they come up, if they want to have a conversation, start the conversation by asking them, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which is the practical, the emotional, and the social. Mm-hmm. And when you ask that, students know what they want. They always have an answer. And I think in a workplace setting, we can do something similar. When someone comes up and they say look, this has been bothering me and I want to talk to you about it, we can say just to be clear, are you asking me because we need to come up with a plan for this? Or is it that you just want to share this with me? Or do you feel like there's something going on our team where they're pushing you into this corner and we need to figure out how to handle that? I think that we don't have to say helped, hugged, or heard, although it's kind of a nice thing to remember. But the thing is that what we're really asking is we're asking, what do you need out of this conversation? We all have a reason for opening our mouth. And sometimes we ourselves have not thought about that reason. And so when someone in the conversation says, what's going on here? What are you hoping to carry away from this conversation? It's something we always appreciate. It always goes over well. So if you are having a really bad day and you come home and you want to call someone who just, talking to them is going to make you feel better. Mm-hmm. Do you know who you would call?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who is it? Can I ask? Like,
So I'd say number one, definitely my partner. Number two, I have two really close friends who I've known for a long time that I would call, and then my dad.
okay, so those people for you are super communicators, and you are
Mm.
probably a super communicator to them.
Hmm.
And my guess is, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, that when you call your dad or you call one of those friends or you call your partner, they just know what question to ask you, right? They ask the
Mm.
right question. If they have to give you some like tough love and some feedback, they know how to do it. They know how to prove to you that they're listening. They probably ask follow-up questions. They repeat what you say a little bit.
Uh-huh.
They are super communicators for you. Now, what's interesting is those are a set of skills that we can use with anyone. And there are some people who are consistent super communicators. There are some people who can connect with literally anyone. And it's not because they're really outgoing or really charismatic or that they're extroverts. They might be introverts. They might be curmudgeonly. It's that they have recognized that what you do in those calls with your friends or with your dad or with your partner is a set of skills. And once we identify those skills, we can use them with anyone. Super communicators are just people who understand what skills make communication work and then use those skills when they want to connect with someone.
Okay, so it's a set of skills, which is great because I think a lot of people immediately go like, well, I am or I'm not, or I'm just not great at communication. And then you also maybe have this archetype in your mind of who a good communicator is. If we take a step back and we're trying to just analyze ourselves, how do I know that I'm a good communicator, a bad communicator, a super communicator, or based on what you're saying, is it that in different contexts, I show up differently?
I think in different contexts, you show up differently, but you could show up in the best way possible each time that you want to. We don't have to have conversations with folks, right? Sometimes you get in the Uber and you do not want to talk to the driver. You just want to check your email. You want to like zone out. And that's okay. You don't have to have any conversations you don't want to have. But when you do want to have a conversation, when you do want to connect with someone, if you understand the skills that make that connection possible, then you show up in the way that you choose, as opposed to just showing up however you happen to be feeling at that moment. And we can talk about what those skills are. The first skill is asking questions. One of the things that we know is that consistent super communicators, they ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And I'll bet you that if I was eavesdropping on a conversation that you're having with your friends or with your dad or with your partner, one thing I would hear is you guys asking each other a huge number of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those questions are just invitation questions, or things like, oh, what did you say next? Or, oh, yeah, then what happened? They're questions designed to invite you in. But some of the questions are what are known as deep questions.
Mm-hmm.
And a deep question is something that asks about our values or our beliefs or experiences. And it's as simple as, if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying like, oh, where do you practice medicine? Asking them, oh, why'd you decide to go to medical school? Or what do you love about being a doctor? Look, those are questions that invite someone to share with you something real.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was to ask you, you live in New York?
Mm-hmm.
Where in New York do you live?
I live in Hamilton Heights.
Okay, Hamilton Heights. So what do you like about Hamilton Heights?
I love that I'm right by something called Riverbank State Park. It has a pool and a track, and it's right on the water. It's really important to me to be by the water. I also love the West Side, never leaving. And we have great restaurants. We're near a beautiful college. There's a lot of stuff outside that you can kind of do and see.
So you just told me so much about yourself, right? You told me so much about how you see the world. So athletics seems like it's important to you. You're probably an athlete, or you swim or you run.
Just ran a half marathon last weekend.
Hey,
so yes.
Congratulations. Congratulations. That's awesome. And you're someone who likes to be social. You like to go to restaurants, right? You're kind of out and about. You're someone who's probably feels a sense of loyalty to place and to other people.
Yes.
Like, you're telling me a lot about your values by answering that kind of simple question. Now, if I had just asked, oh, where in Hamilton Heights do you live? And you were like, oh, I live on 91st or, 102nd.
Yeah.
I would be like, okay, that's kind of a dead end. If I ask you about the facts of your life, it oftentimes doesn't lead to something meaningful. If I ask you how you feel about your life, then I'm inviting you to say something real. And that's what a deep question does. It invites us to talk about how we feel about our life.
It didn't feel like a deep or intense question.
No.
It felt like sure, I can tell you that.
Totally normal question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a distinction here, which is If I had asked, for instance, when's the last time you cried in Hamilton Heights? That would feel like kind of a lot. And the difference there is the difference between an invitation and a mandate. And that question, by the way, wouldn't be a terrible question. It's a deep question, and there's a time and place for that question. In fact, there's a bunch of experiments that have been done with that specific question. But what's important is that when I say, what do you love about Hamilton Heights? Why do you live there? I'm inviting you to get deep. And if you don't want to get deep, you could have just said, oh, it's a great neighborhood. I've been there forever. It's fantastic. Okay. Like this isn't a place where she wants to go. And so that's an invitation. On the other hand, if I ask that crying question, it's more of a mandate. And there's a time and place for a mandate and a time and a place for an invitation.
What's a way that you would suggest to people to open up their shallow questions to make them deep as they're trying to, cultivate this skill?
So I think at the core of every deep question is a basic question, which is, what do you make of this? Right? In the book, there's a story about this guy named Bafara Dai, who's a doctor in New York City. He's a cancer doctor. And he learned that the best way to start his conversations with patients is to say, tell me what this diagnosis means to you. Right? And he could start by saying like, okay, are you scared about pain? Have you thought about treatment options? Let me tell you about survival rates. But instead he starts by saying, tell me what this diagnosis means to you. And what he's really asking is, how do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of the world? How do you make sense of this diagnosis? How do you make sense of yourself? That's at the core of every question. And so sometimes we can say how, and sometimes we can say what. But when we say something like, in a perfect world, how would you do this differently? What we're really saying is, tell me how you think about this. Tell me why this matters to you. Tell me what matters to you. And it's that invitation to someone that matters the most. It doesn't really matter how you phrase it. It doesn't matter which words you use. It's that we want to transmit that we want to connect with them. And this is what supercommunicators really do. This is what you do when you're talking to your dad or your partner or your friends and they're doing to you. We're showing them that we want to connect.
Is there a time and a place to supercommunicate?
Well, the answer is kind of no, except that you get to decide. Like I said, sometimes you get on the bus and you do not want to have a deep conversation with the person next to you. You want to read your book, right? But at other moments, if you do want to have a conversation, you can do this with anyone. You can do it with your barista. You can do it with your boss. You can do it with your parent. It's really the time and the place is about, do you want to have a real conversation?
Mm-hmm. So if I'm saying, yes, I want to have a real conversation and I'm thinking about like different contexts, whether that be at work, I'm trying to talk to my boss about something, or in relationship, I'm trying to talk to, my partner or a child about something. Is there a way in which we need to set the table for that conversation to happen?
I think there's a difference between most conversations and what are known as conflict conversations. So the place where setting the table really matters is if I need to talk to you about something that I'm not looking forward to talking about, or I need to give you some news or some feedback, or just we disagree with each other. So let's say that you do need to have that conversation. There's a couple things that we can do that really help. And a lot of this research comes from conversations about race, which is really, really interesting because conversations about race are deeply intimidating and fearful to many, many people. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we found makes conflict conversations better and easier is before the conversation happens, try and figure out two things. First of all, what is the most important thing that I want to say? And oftentimes we think about this, right? We're thinking about like, I got to give this performance review, and we work out that script in our head of what we want to say. And so when we come into that conflict conversation, oftentimes we're just focused on talking. We're not focused on listening. But if we just take a second and we say to ourselves, like, what's my goal here? What's my goal for myself? What's my goal for the other person? That puts us in a better headspace to be ready to have that hard conversation. The second thing that we should do in those conversations is that oftentimes the biggest barrier to those conversations is our anxiety. And that's legitimate, right? Like when you feel anxious, it triggers that fight or flight instinct. It's very hard to listen. It's very hard to speak rationally. And so the number one thing we can do is when we start the conversation is to say to the other person, okay, look, I want to have a conversation about X. And let me just acknowledge, this is going to be a kind of awkward conversation. It's going to be hard. Actually, the reason I want to talk to you about it is because it's awkward and hard. Like that discomfort is not a flaw. It's the design, right? Like this is why I want to talk about it. And then to say, I might say the wrong thing. Like the space between my brain and my lips, things might get jumbled up, and I might say something that offends you. I might say something that sounds like confusing. And I just want to apologize in advance. Like, if I do that, just let me know and I'll try and clarify. And I also want to let you know, I forgive you in advance for when you make mistakes. Then we start having the conversation. And what's really important in that conversation is that we prove that we're listening to each other. And there's actually a technique for this. In the book, there's a story about an experiment that was done where they brought together gun rights advocates and gun control advocates. And they taught them this one technique that made a huge difference in their conversations. It's called looping for understanding, and it has 3 steps. Step 1 is ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? Step 2 is, after the person answers the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. Now, what's important here is not mimicry. It's proving that you're listening. It's showing that you're processing what they've said. What I heard you say was that you're really scared about this thing and not that thing. And then step number 3, and this is the one we always forget, ask if you got it right. Because what's happening there is one of 2 things will happen. Either the person will say, no, I don't think you totally understood me, which is useful, right? Or they'll say, yeah, no, I think you understand me. And what we're actually doing when we ask if we got it right is we are asking them for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. And hardwired into our brain is an instinct that when we believe that someone is listening to us, we become more likely to listen to them in return. And if you do those 3 things, you will have a better conversation. You might not walk away agreeing with each other. You might not walk away saying, oh, I love that conversation. That was such a blast. But you will walk away saying, I think I understood what the other person was trying to tell me, and I spoke in a way that I think they could understand me.
Okay, so Charles, I'm imagining right now, I'm like, okay, I'm sitting somewhere with anyone who I have a formal or casual relationship with. How do I bring these things in without it feeling overly prescribed or, kind of like an unnatural way of relating to somebody that we typically wouldn't do, right?
Yeah. So one of the things I hear you saying that I often hear from others is this can feel performative, right? It can feel like this looping for understanding. It can feel kind of performative. The thing to understand is language is performative. That's actually the goal of language, right? The reason why I speak to you is because I want to transmit something to you. We're unaware of the performative aspect of it because it's so natural to us. But when I put emotion into my voice, I don't think to myself, oh, that's so artificial, right? I think like, this is very natural for me to put emotion into my voice. The fact that it's performative does not mean that it is, or the fact that it's formal or the fact that it's deliberate does not mean it's not genuine and authentic. It actually means it's more authentic.
Before we go on break, let's recap. There are 3 types of conversations: practical, emotional, and conversations about identities. I don't think I'll forget the alliteration of do we need to be helped, hugged, or heard when it comes to how a conversation goes. Or in a work environment, do we need to make a plan, share, or are we coming with a team or work issue? Whatever you use to remind yourself about these 3 types of conversations, don't be afraid to ask or proactively offer them to people you communicate with. That way, you know what role to play, and they know what you need from them. We'll be back in just a few minutes. And we're back with Charles Duhigg. Charles, I want to ask you, what are the 4 rules for a meaningful conversation?
So the first rule is figure out what kind of conversation you're having. Is it emotional? Is it social? Is it practical? And try and match the other person. The second rule is to try and figure out, what do we both want from this conversation? Oftentimes in every conversation, there's what's referred to in psychology as a quiet negotiation. And the goal of this negotiation is not to win. The goal of this negotiation is to figure out what the other person wants, which is, of course, actually the goal of every negotiation, right? So can I figure out what you want from this conversation? How am I going to communicate to you what I want from this conversation? Which often means I need to figure out what I want from this conversation.
What it is I want.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the second rule. Third rule is just to ask about feelings. Emotions influence every single conversation, right? Sometimes they're small influences, sometimes they're large influences. But if we ignore those feelings, then oftentimes they can make it harder for us to connect. And then the fourth is just to figure out if social identities are important to what we're talking about. And sometimes they aren't, right? The fact that you are a Black woman, I'm a white man, for most of our conversation might not matter at all. But it could when we're talking about differences in communication, when we're talking about different challenges. I'm certain as a woman, you experience different challenges than I experience in the workplace around communication, because I know all the science tells me that that's true. And you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so if we're talking about that, then actually our differences are important. Our social identities are important. And so just being aware of that possibility helps us connect with each other. And that's the 4 rules.
I got certified as a coach 5 years ago, and one of the things that I learned is that most of the time we are listening to respond, right? And so I always think of that as like a ping pong game.
Yeah.
And rarely are we actually listening to hear the context of what's being said and then allow ourselves space to respond. And I think of that more as like, a volley, playing tennis, like a longer sort of drive of the ball. It takes a little bit more time. It's up in the air a little bit more. Maybe there's even a little bit more discomfort, more preparation, and then we go.
Yeah.
How do we get better at this skill?
It's a really good question. One of the things that happens is that we have a sneaking suspicion when we're talking to someone that they are not actually listening to us. They're just waiting their turn to speak, right?
Uh-huh.
What's important is that, number one, that looping for understanding, proving we're listening. And sometimes proving for listening is just asking a follow-up question. It's telling a similar story. It can be repeating what you said, but showing to someone that we actually are listening, that we're processing what they're saying, as opposed to just waiting our turn to speak, that's really important. But the second thing that happens is that sometimes, even though we don't intend to, we start doing that, right? We start thinking about what we want to say. We don't intend to, but we become that person who is just waiting for their turn to speak. And that's why this looping for understanding is so important, because if my mission to myself is, I want to be able to repeat back to you what you're saying in my own way to prove to you that I'm paying attention, I actually have to pay attention, right? Like, instead of doing that little interior dialogue, if my job to myself is, I got to listen closely enough to prove that I'm listening, that helps us short circuit our own faults, our own weaknesses.
My intention then is to prove I'm listening. So the game changes a little bit.
Yeah, the game changes a little bit. And it also changes the definition of success for conversation. Because sometimes we go into a conversation thinking that success means convincing you of something, getting you to admit, I'm right and you're wrong. Sometimes we go into a conversation assuming that the goal is to impress you or to get you to like me or to make you think I'm smart. Those are not the right goals of a conversation. A conversation has one goal, which is to understand each other. I want to understand you, and I want to speak in a way that you can understand me. We might walk away still disagreeing with each other. We might walk away not even liking each other. But if you both feel like you understood each other, you feel connected. And that connection is at the root of how we live with each other. It's the root of our relationships.
Okay, so first of all, just quick distinction on the difference between hearing and listening, right? Is like what you're saying is hearing could just be like, I'm sitting here and you're talking and I can hear everything, versus I'm sitting here, you're talking, and I understand, I'm choosing to understand what you're saying or choosing to allow what you're saying in.
That is a great summation and a really good example of looping for understanding.
Here we are. I'm listening. So actually, I want to ask you this. In your book, you said from infancy, even before we learn to speak, we absorb how to infer other people's emotions from their behaviors, their body language, vocal inflections, glances and grimaces, sighs and laughs. As we grow older, however, this capacity can atrophy. We start paying increasing attention to what people say rather than what they do, to the point where we can fail to notice non-linguistic cues. Can you talk about how we get more intentional about body language or even just notice it in others?
Yeah. So I think when we remind ourselves to notice, it actually becomes much easier. And the story I tell in the book about NASA. So in the 1980s, NASA had this basic problem, which is President Reagan came to them and said, I want you to start sending astronauts into space for 6 to 12 months and building a space station. And for NASA, this was a problem because up till then, their longest mission had been about 10 days long. And it really doesn't matter who you put into space for 10 days. They can be like a jerk. They can be really, really nice. It's fine. It's only 10 days, right? It's going to work out. But if you put people into space together for 6 months or 12 months and they're living in this little tin can and they're not good at emotional intelligence, they're not good at connecting with each other, they're going to make each other crazy. And actually, there had been some examples of this in the past. And so NASA says, look, we got to figure out how to choose candidates, astronaut candidates who have emotional intelligence. But the problem for them is if you make it to the final rounds of a NASA interview, you're awesome, right? You're handsome and beautiful. You have 2 PhDs. You're a fighter pilot. And most importantly, you have been doing interviews your entire life. You know how to perform. You know how to describe your greatest weakness in the most admirable way. You know how to fake emotional intelligence really, really well. And the problem is that someone who fakes emotional intelligence, they can make it through the interview. They can make it through a 10-day mission. They can't make it through a 6-month mission. So NASA had to figure out, how do we tell the difference between people who have emotional intelligence from those who can fake it well? And they gave a problem to this one guy who was this lead psychologist for manned spaceflight at NASA. And he worked on it for months and months and months. And he finally came up with a test. His test was that he would walk into the interview room carrying a big stack of papers. And as he walked in, he would spill the papers as if on accident. And then he would do this thing. He would laugh this huge boisterous laugh. He'd go ha, 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 I can't believe I did that. And then he would pay attention to how the candidate reacted. Because everyone knew they were supposed to laugh back. And some candidates would go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that. And some candidates would go, that's really silly. Let me give you a hand with that.
Uh-huh.
Because everyone knew what was happening here, right? The guy had walked in, he had spilled some papers, and we've all had this experience. He overreacted to apologize for his spill. He overreacted. And so that's compounding embarrassment on top of embarrassment. And some candidates said oh, I'll help you overcome this. Let's just put it under the rug. And some candidates said, I want to make you feel welcome. I'm going to laugh the same way you laughed. I'm going to laugh this big boisterous laugh because I know you're feeling awkward right now. I know you're feeling embarrassed. I'm going to make it easier for you to sit with that. Those were the people who had emotional intelligence. And this is what we know. We know that oftentimes we show our emotions or we show that we're listening through how we behave. Laughter is a great example of this. 80% of the time when people laugh, it is not in response to anything funny. Nobody has made a joke. Instead, we laugh in a conversation to show the other person that we want to connect with them. And when they laugh back, they're showing us that they want to connect in return. Mm-hmm. That's the function of laughter, is to show an intent to connect. And the same thing was true of comforting folks, right? When someone says that they've had a tragedy and we say, oh, I'm so sorry. How are you doing with it? What we're doing is in the tone of our voice and how we approach them, we're showing them that we are listening and that we want to connect with them.
You're meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
And so let's just say we're trying to have a conversation and we notice that someone is in some way shut down. They've got their arms crossed or what they're saying doesn't match their body language. You're like, ooh, something's off here. Do we call that out as super communicators?
Well, I think it depends on the situation, right? Mm-hmm. I think it can be really helpful. The most important thing is just to notice it, right? Because unless you notice it, you don't really know what's going on in that conversation. So the fact that you're saying, they say they're okay with this, but they're frowning and they're crossing their arms and they seem really low energy, I think something else is going on here. And that gives you an opportunity to ask a deep question and to say, I thank you for telling me that you're okay with this. Let me just ask you, in a perfect world, what would you do differently? Because I'm getting the sense that maybe this wouldn't be your first choice. And at that point, what I'm doing is I'm showing them that I'm listening to their body language. I'm listening to what they're transmitting to me. And I'm inviting them to verbalize that feeling instead of just expressing it through their frown.
So we all go home or show up wherever we think we'd like to be better super communicators. What does that actually look like? What would be different about how I'm showing up in your mind?
I think the way it would look differently is that one of you would stop and just say, look, can I just ask you something? Like, what's going on? What's really happening? Why does this matter to you? Because the truth of the matter is, what they're really saying is, I care about you. I care about what you're thinking and feeling. I want to understand you. And at that moment, it's very easy for the other person. It sort of snaps them out of their own reverie. And they say, like, look, here's what's going on. Like, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, now we're talking about real stuff, right? Like and maybe I didn't even mean to go there. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Once it's on the table, then you start to actually have a conversation and you can really connect with each other.
Yeah, it's like they say the topic is never the topic. So like when you're doing something or someone's distracted and they're like on social media, it's like your annoyance isn't about the social media. It's about feeling unseen or not paid attention to. Or when you're in a meeting and someone's typing on their computer or responding to people, your frustration isn't that they're having a conversation. It's that they're doing it and they're showing you in that they don't care about you, or you're believing that they don't care about what you have to say.
Yeah. And sometimes the topic of the conversation is the topic of the conversation, right? What's important is that the more we acknowledge what we actually want to talk about, the more we ask the other person what they actually want to talk about, the more we show we want to understand them and we speak in a way that they can understand us, the more we feel closer to each other. And it's that connection, that sense of connection, is the thing that can carry us through all kinds of obstacles and pitfalls.
I love that. Is there anything that you haven't gotten to say as you've shared the research and the learnings from this book that would be interesting?
I think the only thing is just the importance of these connections. So we talk about connection and we kind of take it as a granted that it's important. But what's interesting is it's actually very important. There's a study, I'm sure you're familiar with it, known as the Harvard Study of Adult Development, where they follow around thousands of people for 80 years now. And they found that the only thing that can predict whether you're going to be healthier and happier and more successful, however you define success, at age 65 is having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45, right? And that means you've had those relationships probably for longer than just the last couple of years. Relationships with other people and connecting with other people is the thing that makes us happy. It also makes us healthier. The Surgeon General has said, being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is a lot of cigarettes. And not only that, but we get exposed to new kinds of opportunities when we have connections, right? People see things that we don't see and they alert us to them. If you want to be healthy, happy, and successful, the best thing you can do is invest in relationships with other people.
Yeah. I love that. That's the why we should care. And sort of the it's sort of an antidote to I think what happens a lot in our society now, which is this sort of hyper individualism or only finding our one little niche that's the people who agree with us so we can talk into our echo chambers, right? And so it's how do we sort of widen that? And it reminds me of, over the weekend, I mentioned I ran this half marathon and I was, running a half marathon is a lonely thing, right? You're running by yourself. Even if you run with a group, it's still you that has to cross that finish line. But, I looked around and realized, as I've been having a few conversations about what makes us happy or what makes us content. And one of those things is that we are not separate from others and recognizing that we're not separate. And so looking around and seeing all of these people doing this with me, and then all of these people on the sidelines cheering for all of us, and then all of
awesome.
Us. I was like, we need each other so much. That's why this matters. Charles, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements for me.
Okay.
Better humans are.
Ooh. Better humans are super communicators.
Better work is.
Better work is what makes you feel excited and happy to walk into the office most of the days. You don't have to be excited and happy every single day.
Totally agree.
Great jobs still have tough days, but most days.
And a better world has.
A better world has people who are more focused on understanding each other than simply shouting more loudly at each other, which is a tough thing right now. We're in a kind of shouting phase of life.
That was Charles Duhigg, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and best-selling author of Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with the first person who comes to mind. You never know how it could help them out. And support people like you in finding our show by leaving us a rating before you go. While you're at it, write a one-sentence review telling me and the team what you love about Everyday Better. And as always, you can get me in your inbox by signing up for our weekly personal development newsletter, giving you practical tips on how to level up with small steps every day. Find it in our show notes for this episode or at linkedin.com/everydaybetter. That's linkedin.com/everydaybetter. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is produced by Grace Rubin and Emily Reeves. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Joe DeGiorgi mixed our show. Enrique Montalvo is the executive producer of LinkedIn Editorial Productions. Dave Pond is head of news production. Courtney Koop is head of LinkedIn Original Audio and Video. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.